after watching the trailer for Avatar: The Way is Water, I absolutely fell in love with the costume and the character design of Kate Winslet's character, Ronal. We're gonna go ahead and try our best at recreating her look. Her netted top looks like a sort of macrame, which I do not know how to do. I really don't have the time to learn it at the moment, so we're gonna cheat. Got a bunch of different trim. They're all braided in a certain way, and this is gonna help cut down on our work. Just took my dress form and wrapped it in some plastic wrap. Protect it from glue and color. This is the one I used for the main texture. Started with the loops on the top. That's the first thing that jumped out at me. Really just at least wanna make that part look as similar as possible. A quick way to do the shoulders, create 4 loops on one strand. Then use some tape to temporarily hold the center together. Pin it in place and do the other side. Right now it's very flimsy, so I need to use the pins to keep it close to the form. Added hot glue to connect some of the pieces. Now let's deal with those shoulders. Cut that tape away and cut the bottom of the loops and create the final shape. Trim down some of the ends because I just didn't want it to get out of hand having all these extra strands. Attach some strands of different trim. This is gonna change up the textures. Taking the original trim and twisting it. This gives the illusion that there's more complex weaving going on. I have a wider trim that I used for the edge. Add some extra pieces to fill in those gaps. Take the ends and feed them through that wider trim. A couple more pieces using a different trim just for more texture. Now that everything's in place, I used a fabric stiffener. You're not gonna wanna just mist your project and move on. You really need to make sure you saturate everything. Grabbed a couple more pieces and added more hanging bits. Now for the color. Using Skin Illustrator Blood Yellow. This is already a liquid form, making it super easy for the material to absorb. It also still wasn't stiff enough in areas, so I did add more of that fabric spray. I have 2 different size beads I got from the craft store. Also some clear thread. Time to get sewing. Added a bunch of beads to the hanging pieces and along that wider trim. I do not sew that much, and I ended up stabbing myself so many times. And that clear thread is an absolute nightmare. Spent about 3 nights sewing those tiny little beads. Created different patterns on the hanging pieces and added some to the main area. Let's add some shells. These shells are from Joann Fabrics from the jewelry section, and these other abalone ones I got from Etsy. Still using that clear thread to add these on. Just alternating the different shells. Now that the chest piece is done, let's take on that shell necklace. Okay, so maybe this is not a necklace. Judging from some of the images, it looks like it's actually attached to that headpiece, but we're just gonna make this a separate piece either way. I did search for a real shell for this piece. Look at this one, so close. I'm gonna have to make one. Use Sculpey polymer clay in the color Translucent. Knead some of the product into a ball and start to lengthen its shape and also twisting. Wrap some extra clay on the ends and time to bake. It did end up cracking, but that's fine. Flatten out 2 pieces and add that to the baked piece, twisting them around that core. Smooth down the edges. It's not perfect, but we're just gonna go ahead and bake that in the oven. As you can see, it's really rough, but it's just gonna need some sanding. And during the sanding, I did end up breaking part of it. Used some old 2-part epoxy, which did end up turning yellow on me. Grab an iridescent nail polish of your choice and cover the piece. Also decided to use some color shifting pigments I had, just for a little more of a color effect. You can also do a similar thing, just using other nail polish colors. Skin Illustrator Grunge Palette, start with prairie dust and paint the ends of the shell. Then start layering the color Din out of that same palette. Did a little light shading in areas using the prairie dust, and since the Skin Illustrator color is matte, I did go back over with some of that nail polish to bring the shine back. Did leave those ends matte though. Those are supposed to kind of emulate the outside of a shell. Now for those green and purple pieces on that string. I found these interesting looking shell segments and just gonna pick some out. Painted them green, originally using Createx Forest Green. Realized I should have been using Createx Wicked colors for this. That line is much better used for stuff like plastic and more slick surfaces. And use that Wicked color for the next part, just mixing the violet and the platinum just to get a lighter purple color. And then just airbrush the narrow ends. Grab some natural string, then add a few of those larger gold beads from earlier to wrap the end of the shell. Used a little hot glue to keep the string in place. Now to put on each of those decorative shells. You can tie a knot or something to keep those shells in place on the string, but I just used a glob of hot glue. I also added a bead below each shell. Then go ahead and do the other side. That's not too shabby. Now let's move on to that headpiece. Grab some more Sculpey for that large shell. Started out with sculpting the basic shape and then adding some ridge detail. Smooth it down, first with a tool and then with some alcohol. Added the 2 holes on the top with the brush handle. Now let's go bake. Did end up sanding it to better smooth it, starting with a low grit and then moving to a higher grit. You do not have to agonize about this. Once we apply the nail polish, that's gonna further smooth the surface. Now we have to figure out the size of the rest of the piece for the head. Pulled out the wig. This one is Urania from Epic Cosplay Wigs. I'm gonna be making the piece out of EVA foam. Use some printer paper to rough out a template. Now let's cut it out. Sketched out the areas that we're gonna wanna cut and burn. For that cool scaly texture, I used some sharp scissors and just kind of nipped the surface. For the low areas, did start to sand with a Dremel before jumping to a burn tool. Make sure you're wearing safety gear when you are sanding or burning any of this foam. You really do not want to be inhaling any of that. This is braided trim I got from Joann Fabric. We're just going to want to match this color. Took Skin Illustrator Grunge Palette using the Sedona color and covered all the foam. Now I did not seal this foam, so it slurped the color right up and it did take a few coats. Now we need to do those shells. So these shells are basically puka, or also called cowrie shells. They're really easy to get. Thing is, I wasn't sure if they were gonna be small enough, and also they're sold in bulk, and I really didn't need 50 to 100 of these things lying around after I was done this project. We're just gonna take some Sculpey and make a very basic shape and a little bit of texture and pop those in the oven. Pull out that trusty nail polish. I did end up feeling that the top was too long, so I cut it off and re-glued it onto the back. Now gluing on the braided trim and using the pointed piece to sit in the middle of that braid. And that's gonna make it look like it's braided into the trim. Hot glue the shells on and added another brown trim for a little more detail. Cut off 2 little pieces of that braided trim to add to the top of the shell. Did put some thin wire behind the trim, so that way I had better control for the final shape. Ended up using some of that clear thread and sewing across each of the shells. I was a little concerned that the hot glue was not gonna hold over time. Sewed some hair clips onto the bottom of the piece. This is gonna help lock it better onto the wig. Now if you want an easier method, you could totally just take this piece and attach it to a headband. I also added a clip to the top part of this headpiece, just so that I had a little control of the positioning. Just gonna add some texture and volume to the top of the wig and tie it back. Braided some of the hair underneath and brought it around the back. Now just clip the headpiece on and get into position. Now we have to create the bodysuit, tail, and even the feet. Head over to the next video and I'll see you there.